Sports are broken. Every sport, at every level, sports are broken. All we have to do to see this reality is to take a look around us. We see this brokenness when we read about Lance Armstrong and his intricate scheme that he developed to cover up his doping, along with the years of vehement denials of all of that practice. We see this brokenness when we read about the 9 youth football coaches and associates in South Florida facing felony charges in connection with a system of rampant, elaborate, and high-dollar gambling on Little League football. We see this brokenness when we read about an obsessive father accused of drugging his children's tennis rivals and unintentionally killing one of them. He was jailed for 8 years as a result of that, and this father was found guilty of manslaughter when one of the players whose drink he had spiked died after losing control of his car on the way home from the match. It wasn't an isolated incident. Investigators found that this was a regular practice over 3 years, and he drugged not only children but adults, boys and girls, 6 boys and 21 girls, 9 were minors. Some who ended up in the hospital, some even taken away from matches on a stretcher. Now, these are just a few of the realities of the fact that brokenness of the brokenness of sports. There are many, many, many more in football, in soccer, in baseball, in basketball, in every sport at every level. From professionals to the earliest of participants, sports are broken. In the last 20 years, at least 3 major studies have been done on the effect of sports on the participants. And all 3 of the studies concluded the same thing. The longer you play sports, the worse your sportsmanship becomes. The longer you play sports, the greater the degradation of your moral character. Now, we probably grew up thinking sports builds character, so we want to get people involved in sports. The question is, though, what kind of character is it actually building? And the reality of these studies is it's building the wrong kind of character because of its brokenness. Now, as this reality is becoming more and more recognized among people, people are responding, trying to do something about it. There have been books written like Why Johnny Hates Sports by Fred Eng. He documents the growing number of children dropping out of organized sports. In fact, I believe he quotes 75% of children quit organized sports by the time they're 13. Not because they don't like to play, but because the system they play in is failing them. Besides the books written, there's been coach certifications that have been instituted. I remember when I signed up to play or to coach in one of the top leagues in terms of participation in our country several years ago. And it's a top organization around the country. And there was no coach certification involved. I don't remember if they even did a background check at that point. I'm sure they would certainly do that today. But there was no, how do you coach? How do you work with kids? What do you know about the sport? What other coaching experience? They just gave me a roster and said, go after it. Now today, I just recently was having a conversation with a gentleman that talked about how went over all the hoops that he had to go through to actually coach in a youth sports organization here in Charlotte. It's a different day, at least in some arenas, about coach certification. Besides that, there are sports organizations that are instituting parental covenants and specific guidelines for spectating. Charlotte Soccer Academy recently sent out a notice to all the parents, and they said they're going to crack down on spectator behavior, and they outlined very specifically the consequences that would take place if you did not cooperate with the officials during the match. In St. Louis, the soccer organization there set out and put a covenant before all the parents. This is what you have to do if you're going to participate as a spectator. These are just a few of the examples of the efforts being made, and I applaud these kind of efforts. But at the same time, I want to point out that to me, their well-intentioned efforts often fall short of dealing with the problem. These efforts usually deal only with the behavioral issues and never get to the heart of the matter. And it would seem, in fact, that if you looked at the landscape, the more these efforts have been attempted, the greater the brokenness of sports is proliferating, broadly and deeply. In the light of that, there are some voices out there that are even saying, because this is so broken, we need to get out of this sport or sports completely, including football, MMA, and boxing, just to name a few. So the problem is apparent and the responses are varied. So how are we today to respond to this? What are we to do? And that's what I want to discuss during this time. Simply stated, I'll tell you right up front that my contention is that we need a complete redemption of sports. All of them at every level. Now, in saying that, I recognize this is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge. You see, there's lots of sports, each sport with a different set of issues. For instance, if you were coaching baseball, one of the questions or one of the practices in baseball that if your team gets thrown at by the opposing team, then if you're the pitcher, you have to defend your team by throwing at them the next time the opportunity comes up. I have a gentleman that I've gotten to know who pitched in the majors, and in his college career, his first pitch in the college career, he went in as a reliever, and their pitcher in this college game had thrown at their batters. And so the pitcher was the guy that was coming up for his reliever, for him to pitch against in relief. The third baseman, who was the captain of the team, this is the freshman, his first time. He's a Christian. He's trying to figure out how to manage the landscape. The third baseman walks over, who's the captain of the team, and says, "You know what you have to do." And he turned around and walked back. And my friend says he wrestled with what to do, and then he decided, he reared back and threw his 95-mile-an-hour fastball and hit the guy right in there in the ribs. And he said, "Bob, if you've ever seen that happen, you know what took place next." The guy crumbled. The coach ran out, who had said that he did not want his pitchers doing that, and said, "Hey, what'd you do? What'd you do? Did that third baseman tell you to do that?" And the guy said no, and he said, "Get out of here." Throw him out of the game. That's an issue. We don't have to go just there. We can go to soccer. If any of y'all know anything about soccer, there's a practice in soccer called butts up. And there's a picture on your screen there of the national women's soccer team doing butts up. And this is where you play a game, and the losers of the game have to stand with their backs to the field in the goal and bend and touch their toes while people shoot at them. And the question is that appropriate? And I've had people defend that on each side of the equation there. Football, another example of this is, in football, if you're a lineman, you cannot grab a defensive man's jersey. It's called what? Holding. But yet, over and over again in football, what interior linemen are taught to do is to keep their elbows in and grab the shoulder pads of the player in like this and push him around like that. And that's why, because they can do what? They can get away with it then. If they get their elbows out and grab, then they'll be called. And I've had Christians defend, that's okay. It's within the rules. There is a thing called chop blocking in football. And it's only illegal in certain circumstances, but it's dangerous in everyone to the opponent that you're doing it to. And again, lots of arguments about whether that's appropriate or not appropriate. So whatever your sport is, just think for a second, whatever that sport is, where are the issues that push the envelope of what's appropriate or not appropriate? I have a friend of mine who's a soccer coach. He is a Christian again, and he says he's taught his players, he's coached at a high school level, state championship level. He said if the game seems to be swaying, the momentum of the game seems to be swaying toward the other team, there's a problem in soccer. You can't do what? You can't call timeout to stop that. So he says fake an injury. Somebody on the field fake an injury. Because what happens when you fake an injury? Whistle blows, timeout's called, slows the game down, and momentum can shift back. Is that okay? Just to illustrate that even further, let me ask you to think for a second the answer to this question. Does God care who wins? Now I'm going to ask you to vote here real quickly. On the count of 3, if you think yes, I want you to raise your right hand. If you think no, I want you to raise your left hand. Okay, hold on, all at once. I'm going to tell you. We're going to do it all at once. Okay, so yes, God cares who wins. Raise your right hand. No, raise your left hand. On the count of 3, do it. 1, 2, 3. Raise your hands. Okay, now, stop for a second. When I've done that before, in almost every setting that I've done it in, half the group says yes, half the group says no. And I looked around very briefly, and you were not unanimous on your vote on that. Some of you said yes, some of you said no. Now, what I'm trying to illustrate is the difficulty, the challenge of filtering through redeeming sports with all these issues and all these challenges, and we're left with a lot of confusion. Confusion illustrated by that vote right then. We're not even clear on a simple, a very critical question like, does God care who wins the game? Recently, on the cover of Sports Illustrated, right before the Super Bowl, this issue at the very top, does God care who wins the Super Bowl? And because of particularly Ray Lewis's involvement in the Super Bowl, there were blogs, there were radio shows, there were talk shows about this subject, and a wide variety of answers to the question. And so what happens, unfortunately, is with all of this confusion, what happens is that we sort of just decide that we won't let our Christianity go into sports. What we'll do is we'll just kind of set aside our Christianity, and then we'll step into sports. We'll live with this compartmentalized view of life where our Christianity and our sports don't really get together because we're so confused about how to get them together. To illustrate that, Val Jin from Gordon College recently interviewed 100 Division III athletes. 100 Division III athletes. And she asked them a series of questions that basically were asking, how does your Christianity intersect with your sports? Now, she didn't ask it this way, but it was basically before, during, and after the game. How does your Christianity kind of affect that? And so, and when she compiled the results, 100 of these, by the way, were self-proclaimed, self-defined Christian athletes, Division III. 100 of them said it affected the way they played before. They said they prayed, they read something, they might have talked to somebody. 100 of them said it affected them after. They prayed, they read, they talked to somebody. How many of them said it affected them during the game? Now, by the very way I'm asking the question, you know the answer is going to be low. The question is just how low. You all want to take a guess? How low? 5. Optimistic, even more optimistic. The answer is 0. 0. None of them saw their Christianity and affecting the way they played. Now, they're not unusual. How many of you have ever heard of Jeremy Lin? Jeremy Lin is an NBA star currently now with the Houston Rockets. Listen to what he says. My faith and my basketball began separately, then slowly converged, and now they influence each other. But when I first started playing basketball, I was 5 years old and my dad put a ball in my hands. Ever since I was a little kid, I just loved to play this game. I was always in the gym. I loved playing. That's what I did for fun all the time. My parents took me to church ever since I was a little kid also. I grew up in the church, but I didn't really become a Christian until I was a freshman in high school. That's when the gospel really started to make sense to me, and I was ready to give my life to God. Then, though, Christianity didn't become a significant part of my approach to basketball until the end of my high school career and into college. So for 4 to 5 years, he saw his Christianity and his basketball as separate, just like those other athletes did. He said, that's when I began, when I was in college, to learn about what it means to play for the glory of God. My parents had often talked about it and told me that I should play for God's glory, but I never understood quite what that meant. That was something that really boggled my mind. I thought, I want to do well for myself and my team, but how can I possibly give that up and play selflessly for God? Do you see what he's saying? He's confused about how in the world to redeem the sport that he plays. Recently, I was going through this same material with a group of coaches, and afterwards, just like you all, a tall young woman approached me. She was obviously an athlete, over 6 feet, and she went on to tell me that she'd played volleyball in college at a Christian university. And she said, Bob, you know, when you were talking about this, I realized that we prayed before the game, and we prayed after the game if we won. And then she kind of laughed. But she said, Bob, you know, all the time I played, I never thought about God during the time that I played. And until I sat here today, Bob, I never even thought there was anything wrong with that. Do you see the challenge that is before us to bring this redemption of sport to a world that sees sport and Christianity as separate is really significant. So we've seen the reality, the response, and the challenge. And then I could just say, what's the solution? The solution is the redemption of sports, as I said before. But I know when I start to unpack that that's a term that we throw around that, again, is not often understood or discussed. We need to redeem this realm. We don't know really what that means. Can any of you, just out of curiosity, can you tell me what the definition of the word redeem is? What's the definition of the word redeem?
Make good again.
To make good again. You're extending a little, but you're close. The again is important. When you redeem a mortgage or you redeem something from a pawn shop, you buy it back. So it's bringing something back. Now, to make it good is you've really gone beyond the idea of redemption. But that goes to the purpose of buying something back, which would be, I would say, to restore it, which would be to bring it back to its original state. So when I talk about the redemption of sports, I'm talking about getting it back so that we can restore it to its original state. Okay? Or, as you said, to make it good again. To make it like it was originally intended to be. Now, when I say that, though, what I want you to realize is that I'm talking about much, much more than just a change in behavior. It's got to go far deeper than that. You see, all the rules in the world that the Cycling Federation set up to stop doping did not hinder Lance Armstrong from figuring out a way to dope. Why? Because the rules never addressed the drive in his heart to win at all costs, taking no prisoners, justifying it because everybody else was doing it. Rules never can change the real problem. And so that's why we recognize up front that this redemption has got to go much deeper. It's got to bring about an inner transformation, not just an outer behavioral change. Now, the Apostle Paul speaks about this idea in Romans chapter 12. He's gone 11 chapters on this incredible treatise of the gospel and on this idea of how God has been at work on our behalf. And there are 11 chapters which I think only have one command in them in chapter 6. Then in chapter 12, he gets practical with these verses. And let's read them together. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, there are 3 commands in these verses. What's the first command? Present your bodies. Now, there's a very important observation out of that we get, is that Christianity is not just a head thing. It's not just a spiritual thing. Here he says, when I get practical with you Christians, you young Christians, I want you to know that I want you to present your bodies. And we as sports people should get very attentive at that, because sports is all about our bodies. But then he makes it very clear, though, how we're to present them. Present them as what? Living sacrifices. Someone jokingly said one time, the problem with living sacrifices is that they keep slipping off of the altar. But he says, this is the kind of living sacrifice you are. What kind? What does he say? Living sacrifice is what? Holy and acceptable to God. Now, he spent 11 chapters explaining to his audience how that holy and acceptable to God sacrifice had been obtained. What God had done to make us set apart for His glory and now acceptable to Him as this sacrifice. 11 chapters he's been talking about this on all what He had done through Christ to make that possible. And he says, okay, as a result of that, now offer yourself in light of what Christ have done. By the mercies of God, I appeal to you, give yourself, present yourself as a living sacrifice. And then he says two more commands. This is what he first has in mind, something not to do, and what's that? Don't be conformed to this world. When you are a living sacrifice, don't let yourself be conformed to the world. The world is trying to squeeze you into its mold. The win-at-all-cost mentality, the survival of the fittest, this idea that there is no real competition here. We just want to have fun. We don't need to have winners and losers. It's really just a competition with ourselves. This worldly thinking is trying to squeeze us. And men and women, I just outlined to you the brokenness of sports testifies to how we violated that command, doesn't it? We have been conformed. I could tell you coach story after coach story, player story after player story, people that would consider themselves committed Christians who've actually violated the principles of Christianity on the court or on the field. Because they're being conformed to the world and even then turning around and justifying it. But then he says, here's how you're not conformed to the world. What's the next command? Be transformed. Be transformed. Now this word is a beautiful word. The transformation there is very clearly an inside to out transformation. The word is transliterated into the English where we get metamorphosize. Metamorphosis. Now, remember with me, if you go back to your grade school biology or middle school or high school biology class, give me an example of an animal that's metamorphosized. Butterfly from a caterpillar. Okay, it's beautiful. The process of metamorphosis takes that caterpillar and turns it into a butterfly. Give me another animal. Ribbit, frog from a tadpole. And they become totally different animals. Tadpoles live where? You take them out of the water, they what? They die. A frog is an amphibious animal, can move in and out. Butterflies fly. Caterpillars crawl. This is the metamorphosis that Paul is picturing here. It's a huge change. It's a change that totally transforms the person. But he tells something very, very important when he uses a particular verb, voice. Now, the verb is in the present tense, which means you should ongoingly be transformed, just as you should ongoingly present your bodies, ongoingly not be conformed. But the voice here is important. The voice, there are two voices, at least, that are significant to us usually in English. We think of the active voice, which is like, I hit the ball. That verb there is the active voice. I, the subject, works through the verb on the object. I hit the ball, right? The passive voice would be like this. The ball was hit by me. The object works through the verb to the subject. The ball was hit by me. The passive voice. This verb, be transformed, is passive. You be transformed. There's an implied object. And who is that? By God. So it's not you get out there and work hard at being transformed. No, it's exactly the opposite. You allow yourself, like the ball, to be hit by the object. You allow yourself to be transformed by the object, God. But then he goes on to say, how do you do that? Be transformed by the renewal of your minds. This is the way that you cooperate, that you get in the place that God can actually change you. You renew your minds. So we need to recognize right up front that the transformation, in order for it to happen, involves a new way of thinking. A whole new way of thinking about sports. A whole new way for you to approach coaching, or if you're a player to approach playing, or if you're a spectator to approach spectating. And this new way of thinking, it comes from a biblical framework that looks at sports and addresses the brokenness and brings about the redemption that we're talking about. And so there are at least 4 components to this biblical framework. One is a picture of the original design of sports and competition. Secondly, a picture of the corruption that the fall has brought to sports and competition. Third, a picture of the restoration steps for sports and competition. And fourth, a picture of the final outcomes for sports and competition. Now, the question is, where do we get that picture? Well, I'm going to tell you that we get it in the gospel.